Mr. Ralph Adams. I'm the Associate Dean of RSIS, and I'll be moderating this session on Chinese public diplomacy in Southeast Asia and Oceania. I would like to start by congratulating again the authors of the study. They've obviously generated a lot of debate since this morning. And this particular panel will try to apply some of their findings to three main Southeast Asian countries: the Philippines, Malaysia, and Thailand, but also, of course, the wider Southeast Asian region overall. And we will have one speaker, although he is not physically present in the room, focusing on Oceania. So let me briefly introduce our four panelists this afternoon. Their bios are obviously included in the conference booklet, so I will be reasonably brief here. On my immediate left, Professor Aileen Baviera, a professor of Asian Studies at the University of the Philippines. And we have Associate Professor Kuik Cheng-Chwee, who is Associate Professor Strategic Studies and International Relations Program at the National University of Malaysia. Dr. Thitinan Pongsudhirak, who Executive Director, Institute of Security and International Studies, Chulalongkorn University. And Associate Professor Tarcisius Kabutaulaka, who sadly could not be with us here today, but you may see his face right now on the screen. And what he has kindly done is to pre-record a short statement on that topic, and we will listen to him in a bit later on. He's an associate professor at the Center for Pacific Island Studies, University of Hawaii. So as we did this morning, this is very much meant to be a conversation rather than a series of long speeches. So what I will do is that I will get the ball rolling by asking our three panelists here present to address two sets of questions, issues. And then once they're done with that first set of issues, we will listen to our colleague who is in Hawaii, and then I will have some follow-up questions. So to get us all started, the two sets of questions that I would like to ask Aileen Cheng-Chwee and Thitinan are the following. First, to briefly describe Chinese public diplomacy within their own countries. What has China been up to? And what, in their view, has driven Chinese actions? And of course, what have been the main outcomes? So just to give us a flavor of Chinese public diplomacy in those three pivotal Southeast Asian countries. The second set of issues, of course, is how Chinese public diplomacy has been perceived domestically. How have domestic perceptions perhaps evolved over time? And ultimately, to refer to what Ambassador Bilahari-Gasikan was talking about a moment ago, have there been clear examples of pushbacks? So why don't we start with Aileen?
Yeah. Well, thanks to the organizers for this invitation. I think there's already been some discussion of the Philippines as a case in the study of aid data. Basically, China is involved at all of those levels, also from infrastructure, financial, diplomacy, information, cultural, and the whole works. What I think makes the Philippine case interesting is that it's not, like other countries, I suppose, it's not tabula rasa. There's already a president. There are immediate developments in relations. Particularly during the previous government when we had our crisis over the South China Sea issue, that shapes the receptivity of people, of the domestic audience to public diplomacy. I think with respect to those particular circumstances, I find that Chinese diplomacy has been rather targeted at certain groups. for instance, media. There seems to be an assumption by the Chinese that the reason that the Philippines is such a hard nut to crack as far as its Southeast Asian relations are concerned is because it is too Western influence. We only listen to one side of the story. It's always the Western perspective, the Western narrative, which I think is true to a large extent, even. But for that reason, they are very eager to build links with the Philippine media institutions. So they organize tour groups, bring them to China, see how the successes of China's own media, how technologically sophisticated they are, how large their resources are. So that sort of thing goes on. No? The youth also, of course, is a target because, well, if you understand the political system of the Philippines, no? And the alliance relationships and everything, the colonial history as well. So it's very difficult for China to pierce through these close ties with the US particularly. But now we have the young people in the Philippines. This is the first post-US military bases generation. So they don't have that recollection. Not many of them, partly because of the dilution of scholarships, for instance, made available to Filipinos. Not too many of the young people now still go to the United States as their first choice for higher education. So you do have potential for the next generation to be perhaps more sympathetic to China and what China represents. Another target is local governments. We were talking about the sister city relations. So of course, the main attraction there is how successful China has been with its own local administration, the high levels of urbanization, poverty, livelihood, that sort of thing. And I still believe that this is the main source of China's soft power, if anything, its own success. And that is what is the most persuasive element of Chinese public diplomacy. And therefore it makes a lot of effort in bringing people over just to see high-speed railways, just to impress everyone with its successful story. So local governments are very, open to this kind of approach. Another target, I suppose, well, we spoke about the political parties. That the fact that the ruling party in the Philippines has built linkages directly with the Communist Party of China. So that is there as well. But as our ambassador also mentioned, I wouldn't put too much emphasis, maybe I wouldn't be so concerned about this, because what you learn about the Chinese political system is, I personally would find so incompatible with what politics is in the Philippines. No? So that they're bound to maybe draw some lessons, but more, what doesn't apply rather than what applies to the Philippines. And it just will underscore to them how different we are, rather than how much we have in common, the way the politics goes. No? And in terms of outcome, I think it's the same. For media, when our media people go to China, they realize how different the two systems are. The press in the Philippines, of course, is very free, very jealous of this freedom. And when they see that, okay, China has its advantages, they deliver the message, but it's the message of the state. And the role of the media in the Philippines is not to convey the message of the state, but very often to contest it. So again, they get some, they're impressed, they get some lessons, and then in the end they say, no, this is not going to work for the Philippines. So as far as outcomes go, we're not even talking about what is insidious or covert. I wouldn't really consider that part of public diplomacy, that as part of public diplomacy necessarily. No? But even as far as this, if you say cultural diplomacy, informational diplomacy goes, then I expect that there will be only limited success on the part of China. But most, if you think short term, because for most Filipinos, especially in under the previous government, we were bombarded with almost, daily reports of what China's doing with South China Sea, that there was a lot of heavy-handed actions and harsh rhetoric on both sides, not just coming from the China side, but on both sides. So that's still in the memory of people. So as far as many people are concerned, China had already shown its true colors. So how do you take that back? How do you erase that from the memory in order for public diplomacy to really be more successful? So I think it's not tabula rasa. There is a lot of factors contribute to the receptivity. There are very legitimate efforts, of course, on the part of China to improve its image. And those can be very successful as well. But I think by and large, it's an uphill climb. The intra-elite, I guess these elite linkages would be one area, given the orientation of the current government, to watch out for. And we were talking about transparency earlier. You have that in the Philippines. We have investigative journalists who are looking into who are on these Chinese companies bidding for infrastructure projects in the Philippines. What other projects have they done? So at that local level, there's this huge effort to introduce transparency into the processes. So I think I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Aileen. So there is no immediate need for pushback simply because the level of influence may not be that significant. And that may be the result of the fact that the two systems are simply too different. Let's now look at the Malaysia case. Cheng-Chwee, tell us how China has been operating in Malaysia, but also how the Malaysian government and wider public has been responding.
Sure. Thanks very much, Ralph, and a very good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers, particularly Joe and Yusoboni, for having me here. I think the panelists in the morning, panel 1, Samantha and University, have done a great job in elaborating the case of Malaysia. So here, to answer the two questions that Ralph has, I would provide a 3-point answer to each of the two questions. So 3 points for the first question about how do I describe China's public diplomacy in Malaysia. So point number 1, China's public diplomacy in Malaysia is not the entire, and in some respects, it's not the entire public, and sometimes it's not so public. So that's point number 1. Point number 2, sometimes, and let me emphasize that, sometimes it's also not so diplomatic. And the third point, despite these two issues of not the entire public and that's so diplomatically, occasionally, the impact, and that's my third point, is that you do see a big impact in terms of the shift of perception that has been described by the panelists, but also in terms of physical presence of China. So by that, I'm referring to all kind of the infrastructure projects that you see all over Malaysia. So let me elaborate one by one, hopefully very quickly to live up to my name, Kuik. So I'll try to cover each of the 3 points very briefly. So about the first point, when I use the notion of not the entire public, by that it means that for those of you who are familiar with Malaysia, we are a multi-ethnic country. So we do have different ethnic groups. And I would think that a more proportionate public diplomacy should be more proportionately targeted at different ethnic groups. But clearly in this case, China's public diplomacy has focused primarily, no surprise, not surprising at all, on the ethnic Chinese, which is a quarter of the country's 31 million population. So you do see that across the sectors, not just the socio-economic and business groups, but also to some extent even university, media, so on and so forth. And I am not saying that Chinese diplomats do not, or the public diplomacy activities do not engage our ethnic Malay friends, but I would say that it's relatively much smaller. And there are many indicators that you could see. For example, during the reception or activities organized by the Chinese embassy, you are not quite sure whether you're actually in Malaysia. So because of you do see more ethnic Chinese than say non-ethnic Chinese, ethnic Malays, and also Indians. So that's one indicator. And but I do want to acknowledge that although it's a bit late and too early little too little. But I think Chinese government authorities have made some efforts in engaging certain groups from ethnic Malays majority. So I would say that they have already tried to do that by offering scholarship. There are some youth programs, and also they try to engage some social cultural entities. Like for example, they want us to start to select an entity to promote the Malay language. But I would say still proportionally is really relatively little. So that's point number one. Point number two, sometimes not so diplomatic. I don't think I need to elaborate because of the, early on, I mean, there were cases, and then I think Gilari also said by quoting about the ambassador. It's not the current ambassador, but the earlier ambassador, Wang Wei, who made that infamous statement in Darling Street. And that clearly it was really not the right move. And then I would clarify that it's not just ethnic Malays who feel uncomfortable, in fact quite upset about that statement. Many ethnic Chinese, myself included, our reaction is that he's such a busybody because of we do not think that he has any rights or standing to represent them. Which brings me to one point that I would like to elaborate. So sometimes I do come across some analyses and also reports about how domestic constituencies are responding to some of these issues. And then there was some kind of a very gross interpretation that ethnic Chinese generally are more quote-unquote supportive or sympathetic to Chinese. So I would think that, I think it's not, it used to be, there is a clear racial line. But today I would say that this ethnic line about how do we see China, I think it's blurred by many variables. In terms of generations, that's one. In terms of what sector, and also which agency do you belong to. So for example, even business sectors, some SME actually are very critical about Chinese presence in Malaysia. So I do think that these three aspects, I mean, not the entire public, sometimes not so diplomatic, but despite this problem, as I said, there is a big presence. And I say big in terms of not just the physical presence, the project, infrastructure project in Malaysia, but you do see, you can compare it. We talked about it during dinner last night. You compare it in the regional basis. Malaysia is one of the few which thus far in a relatively short period of time have already responded to China's projects much more than many other regional countries who are still observing, negotiating, and talking. So you do see there is a number of indicators. For example, in terms of, I would say, geographical scope, in terms of the range of infrastructure projects, and in terms of also the size. You do see cases in Malaysia are pretty big. Like geographical scope in the sense that it's not just one or two places in one or two states. In Malaysia, we have federal states, 13 states. Virtually every state you do see some Chinese project. And in terms of types of infrastructure, it's not just about railroad project. You do see also many other projects like ports, pipelines, so on and so forth. And it is so big that it was an election issue. And I think by now, I think it's quite clear that Mahathir at the time was still an opposition, and a number of opposition leaders and also NGOs and so forth have openly criticized Chinese project. I think East Coast Rail Link, those rail projects linking the East Coast of Terengganu, Kelantan, Terengganu, Pahang, all the way to Port Klang in Klang Valley area, is one big example. But Mahathir clearly also criticized about other projects, for example, not too far from here, the Forest CD incident. And I would like to quote someone from the opposition, in fact, Anwar Ibrahim's daughter herself, Nurul Izzah, who has a notion to describe China's presence. And she said that Chinese presence in Malaysia, especially the infrastructure projects, is too much, too fast, and too soon. And I would think that that captures the sentiments at the grassroots level very well. Which brings me to address the second question. So we fast forward to the recent election. So now I'm talking about basically the impact of Mahathir 2.0 under of a new Malaysia when they took over from the new government. And I have 3 points, 3 R's. So the first R is about, and that's to clarify a lot of the things that we have read from the news so far. I think the news have left the impression that now the new government is really going after the China-related projects, kind of revoking, cancelling the projects and so forth. And it was kind of interesting to read the notion that was contained in the report, shifting sands. And I think that's a very catching, and that leave that actually concur with the reports that have been put forward, and in fact many people have speculated. But I think the reality is more nuanced in the sense that some of the sands I think have already mixed with cements to become concrete in certain projects. And we do want to clarify that a number of China-related projects actually have taken place well before Najib, well before Xi Jinping's Belt and Road. So because of one NDB, one leave the impression that all these are being overthrown, which is not true. So the 3 R's that I want to clarify is that point number 1, the new government under Mahathir 2.0 is actually reviewing and not necessarily revoking the China-related projects. So that's point number 1. Number 2, on the larger issue of Malaysia's relationship or policy towards the big powers, it's really about recalibration, second R. Recalibration or adjustment rather than a change of policy in Malaysia's big power strategy. Number 3, the third R is it's about renegotiations. We have to understand what Mahathir and also his government has been commenting, saying some announcement are too big over the last few weeks since 10th of May as a larger scheme of the renegotiation. And renegotiation process, I would say that started even the next day after the election. On 10th of May, you can check the report, during the press conference, when he was asked about the future of China's project in Malaysia, Mahathir said a few things that I thought very, very telling. So number 1 is exactly that Malaysian government, the new government, will review all the programs so that the terms will be correct, so that the unequal clauses arrangement will be removed. And then he quickly said that Malaysia supports China's Belt and Road initiative. So he's trying to send a signal to reassure Beijing that despite these issues, we are not departing. And more importantly, he quickly mentioned about South China Sea. And he mentioned about we don't like what is going on in South China Sea, too many warships. And warships attract warships. The reason why I'm making these 3 points is to clarify that actually what have been reported in some journals or also internet platform by saying that, look, Mahathir has chosen to visit Japan as the first country after taking over, shows that he's back in the so-called East policy. He's going to be pro-Japan and then depart from China, which I don't think is true. And I think Mahathir actually is more nuanced than that. He is trying to do what your report have concluded very well. I think you mentioned 2 things which I completely agree. For Malaysia to have a leverage vis-a-vis China on all these public diplomacy and related projects is that first, China has to understand our position, and secondly, you need to have multiple players also engaged so that China is not the only player. I don't think Mahathir read the report, but he's doing exactly what has been moved forward, in the sense that he's trying to increase the leverage on Malaysia in terms of correcting all those unequal terms, and also try to have issue linkage. It's not just about 1 or 2 projects of ECRL or SSER, but it's about the overall China's development projects in Malaysia, plus also South China Sea. And he's doing what he has been doing on the basis of renegotiation. I'm stopping.
Thank you very much. I note your point, to quote Ibrahim Stolzers, too much, too fast, too soon. And thank you very much also for clarifying what Mahathir's thoughts might be. As you can imagine, we spend a bit of time in Singapore speculating on what he's up to. So thank you very much for doing that. I also now fully understand what Malcolm was saying this morning about the weather conditions, except that none of us actually grew up in Canada. So we are trying to do what we can. On that note, Thitinan, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Ralph, and thank you, organizers. Look, I don't have 3 C's and 3 R's. I have 1 P. There's 1 point, 1 main point, but it cascades into other points. You know, to me, it seems that China is reclaiming something. We talk about public diplomacy, we can talk about statecraft, we can talk about soft power, power acquisition, power maintenance, power projection. This is really the issues that we are discussing, the confluence. But it seems, you know, they're reclaiming something, and we are in the business of trying to see what China wants. And I think it's not just to be #1 in Asia and #2 in the world. And not #2, definitely not #2 to me. I think China would, in the longer term, be second to none. It doesn't have to be #1, but second to none. And you can see this in a way of their kind of their own manifest destiny, right? So I mean, the U.S. has a manifest destiny. Why can't China have one in the longer sweep of half a millennium? You know, it's just 200 years apart. It comes 200 years later. So this seems to me to be the context. We can see this in all kinds of initiatives, AI, BRI, and so on. And when it comes to public diplomacy, they are learning by doing. I think they are trying, and I think that they should be given some space, some opportunity in so doing. But at the same time, the Chinese must not try too hard. You know, I've been critical in my writings of China and South China Sea, and I'm talking a bit about the Mekong dams. But I've noticed that they are learning fast, and the learning curve is rather impressive. So as a case in point, if you look at the indicators that you have, the sister cities, I never hear about sister cities. The exchange, okay, the CGTN, I see that they have expanded their office, CCTV, CGTN now is apparently more important than CCTV in their global outreach. But if you look at the scholarships, the exchanges, all fine. I mean, we have unprecedented number of Thai students studying in China, unprecedented number of military officers and so on. At the same time, if you offer a free first-class holiday package to an average Thai, you say, okay, where would you like to go? They would say, Japan. They would like to go see snow in Japan. And this says a lot because, you know, no matter what China does, however much it does, it has limitations. And this is also goes to the point that China cannot be viewed and studied in isolation. We have to look at Japan, even Korea, and so on. So in terms of elite, I think that's the key. It's very much elite and financial. Because it's so elite-driven, China risks pushback. You know, you saw this in Malaysia. China doesn't engage with opposition, not so much. They don't engage as an open society, open culture kind of approach. Like, you know, if you have a national day, you have an academic seminar, all kinds of foreign diplomats and academics and so on, they would come in and listen and interact. China doesn't do it. They go to where they want to go. Otherwise, they don't just generally engage. Now, as a result, they don't engage with opposition. So I can imagine, you know, someday the Cambodian opposition is going to win. They have been completely decimated. They've actually run for their lives now outside. But this is a strategic mistake for China. In Thailand, same. When the opposition, when eventually there's an election, the elected government will be less forthcoming, less enthusiastic about the Chinese embrace. And this goes for other countries. Let me just give an example of the elite-driven kind of financial. So in mainland Southeast Asia, there's a Mekong River, right? It runs up and down, upstream, downstream, and it passes through mainland Southeast Asian countries, Myanmar, Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, and of course China at the top. So China has built these dams at will now, a string of dams. I think a dozen planned. They've got half of the dams now built. And you know, their water diplomacy means that they can release, that they can kind of hog the water. It's analogous to the South China Sea. South China Sea, they're building land in the sea. Here they're hogging the water on land. Now this is in violation of existing kind of norms in the Mekong River Commission, some kind of a framework that has governed dam building considerations and issues for more than 2 decades. So in a short time, China's got its own rules and framework and regime. It has now the Lanchan Mekong Cooperation Summit. It has already 2 summits in 3 years. Very fast. But I have seen up close how they've done this. Very elite, minister to minister, leader to leader, and they said, we do this. And then about 5 years ago or so, they must have had some directive from the top say, okay, do more think tank. So they've had a lot of think tank engagements with financial backing. So in one case, there's several years ago, a think tank workshop on ASEAN China. And China would approach ASEAN think tanks, certain think tanks, and they would say, okay, let's do this together. We can fund everything. And in my case, I said, well, look, I have to do all invitations and all programming, right? All topics, everything. Oh, sure, fine. So no interference. Came on the day with a wad of cash in $100 bills. Here's for the conference. And this is really astonishing. So I, of course, did not go anywhere near the cash, but an accountant had to count this cash, and we had to call the money changer to the hotel right away, just so that we would exchange the money, the US dollars right away, and book it into Thai baht, into the accounting, into the books. So it's all kind of transparent, but it was astonishing because somehow they want to do something, they do it. And they've now concluded, decided that they need to do more think tank outreach, and there are many more think tank workshops that I can talk about in the LMC context. We don't have a Cambodian here, 2 more minutes. The Cambodians also have been kind of arm twisted into organizing this. In Thailand's case, because I'm kind of autonomous and seeing it as it goes based on merit, they just go to another think tank, to the foreign ministry. So the Minister of Foreign Affairs just asked the Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs in Thailand and say, look, can you think tank join our think tank in the consortium for the Lan Chang Mekong Cooperation? And this is happening. So now they can claim that there's a think tank network behind the Lan Chang Mekong Cooperation. So it goes to show that I think they were clumsy, much clumsier before, but they're learning fast. A lot of resources, very elite driven, and they have certain targets and they go to them. In the medium, longer term, I think this could be counterproductive. We're seeing some pushback. I think in the worst case, the pushback could become a kind of a backlash. And they have to be careful about that. At the same time, we also have to give them some chance to reach out and to conduct diplomacy, because they have a right to reclaim their rightful place around here.
Thank you, Thitinan. For the record, RSIS has never received an envelope full of cash. Chinese thing that I just thought Okay. Before we listen to our colleague from the University of Hawaii, there is one question that I would like to ask all of you, and it was touched upon by Thitinan. China's ability to learn quickly and to adjust to new circumstances. Obviously, we've had fundamental political transformations in many countries, but especially also in Southeast Asian countries. Thitinan mentioned that China tends not to speak to the opposition, and that this ultimately could undermine their public diplomacy. Aileen, all of you, have you had a sense that China is learning from those lessons, realizing that domestic politics can be very unpredictable? Sometimes you deal with a partner who is perhaps more favorable. I'm thinking of the Philippines. Sometimes you may be dealing with a partner who is slightly less favorable. Do you have a sense that this is something that China is now factoring in its public diplomacy?
I think very much, yes. They're looking at this. I've been speaking, engaging the Chinese in dialogue for many years, and this issue had come up in the past, whether it makes sense for China to try to strengthen ties with political parties in the Philippines. Now, as many know, the political party system in the Philippines is extremely weak. there is no, I mean, really solid political party. They're active when there are elections, and everybody shifts to the winning side after elections. So that's it doesn't really add much. My own advice to the Chinese is I don't think it will really add much to your influence or soft power or whatever if you go that track. On the other hand, the political elite in the Philippines is not necessarily party-based. These are local officials. These are, who get elected, who are part of provincial elites and get elected into Congress, and therefore they have influence. So I think partly the city-to-city, sister city, sister province arrangements are also trying to get there. No? It's anticipating that some of these people, maybe in the ruling elite someday, will be elected as congressmen and so on. So I think yes, they are looking at beyond. They're just starting to see that beyond the current government, they will have to link up with institutions, maybe with certain personalities.
So 3 points. First point is exactly what Jay mentioned earlier on, that China does not really engage opposition. And that's very true in the case of Malaysia. And in fact, I think it was not a secret anymore that Bai Tian, the current ambassador, actually refused an invitation from Lin Kuan Yew, who is now the current finance minister. But earlier on, he was the chief minister in Penang. And Bai Tian refused, turned down the invitation primarily because of that ground. And second point is that I think he's paying the price now. In the sense that the new government will take over, and then some of them, not everyone in the new government, but some of them remember how China was reacting when they were still in the opposition. And the third point is that whether or not they are learning, yes, and they are learning, I would say, quite painfully. They are learning quite painfully in the sense that because of all the statements that Mahathir has been making, and also the new government has been announcing, they have sensed that there was a higher sense of crisis. They are worried that some of these projects that will be revoking and so on and so forth, at least renegotiated. So they have been very much, I would say, that in damage control mode at the moment. And the good news for them is that Mahathir actually did receive an audience with the ambassador. And in fact, Kun Dai, the chief of Council of Elders of the new government, also met Bai Tian. More importantly, in fact, they are actually arranging for Mahathir to make a visit to China, official visit, and this is going to be actually happening very, very soon, which is why I clarify that Mahathir's position vis-a-vis the big powers is very much about recalibration rather than a change of course.
Your country is in the midst of change as well, with elections expected next year. Do you have the impression that China is speaking to the other side?
Yeah, I have 2 points now. First, it's a matter of degree, so it's not binary. Coming back to the question about China and regimes, governments in the region. So, for example, Cambodia is all in. So suppose that Hun Sen loses out sometime, and the opposition wins. They're not going to be all out on China. No one can be all out on China. So it's a matter of degree, but that space, that gap, provides some leverage vis-a-vis other countries like Japan, US, and so on. So, for example, President Trump, Gilhari mentioned earlier. I mean, he actually has given more space to regional governments by being Trump, and by also coming back into the region a bit more. I think pivot rebalance, I think, was a bit disappointing and under-delivered. With the Trump talk and his transactional approach and all kinds of things about him, actually has provided some space for leverage around the region. So it's a matter of degree. Even if governments change, no one can ignore China. Okay? And then the other point is about China has an input-output approach, right? Maybe a bit merchant background. So when it comes down to real implementation, after the coup in Thailand, of course, China is very friendly to any kind of government, especially authoritarian governments, so they can always seek support, superpower recognition from China. And then, in Thailand's case, in the first 6 months, a lot of activities, flurry of high-level visits, they drew up plans to have a rail project, north-south, in southern China, and so on. And then when the terms came, and this was mentioned earlier, the terms that were a rip-off. Not very long repayment period, higher interest rates, very low grace period, short grace period. So typical Japanese ODA kind of loan would be 30-year repayment, maybe 0.5, maybe 1% interest rate, 10% grace. In China's case, it was 20% repayment, 20 years repayment, 4 years grace, 3 or 4% interest. So it's and then the Thai government by that time, you can see this almost a complete correlation. Late 2014, just 6 months after the coup, they went straight to Tokyo after they saw the Chinese were proposing. And of course, Abe in February 2015, saw General Prayut, the junta leader, and Japan got in on it with some programs, some railed proposals as well. None of it has really been constructed. So when the Chinese does its projects, when it comes to real terms, they still not winning friends there. So the project is very slow coming off the ground.
Final question from me before we compare Southeast Asia to Oceania. This morning, the point was made that Chinese public diplomacy is often devoid of values. That there is no clear set of values that China is trying to promote through its public diplomacy. In the context of your individual countries, would you agree with that?
Yes, I suppose I would. Yeah, it's more about the success, selling the story of success and not values.
Well, I think by definition, public diplomacy is accompanied by values. And without explicit values, that is a value. Right? So there's always an agenda, a certain vested interest there. So in the case of China, it's not going to be, elections and democracy and open society and free media and all of that. Those are not their emphasis. But because of that, that is a value in itself. So they say, you have control media, the internet censorship, and so on and so on. That's fine. So I think the whole values thing it has to be flipped around a bit and seeing it from the China perspective. It's just not typical.
Okay. Cheng-Chwee, any particular response about that?
I guess a quick response would be China has its own set of criteria and conception about values. So they are not value in the sense in terms of one we are more familiar with, but I think they value in terms of a relationship, how countries are responding and interacting, engaging with China. So I guess it's very much about the value in terms of political relationship rather than what we would more familiar with.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, we've discussed the Southeast Asia case. Let's now look at what's happening in the Pacific. And again, to reintroduce him, Associate Professor Kabutaulaka, who is an Associate Professor, Center for Pacific Island Studies at the University of Hawaii.
Good afternoon and hello from Honolulu. First, my sincere apologies for not being able to make it to Singapore. But I hope my comments in the next few minutes will contribute to the discussions. My focus is on Chinese diplomacy in the Pacific Islands or Oceania region. 3 points that I want to start with. The first, China is a relatively new power in the Oceania region, but one that is increasingly becoming important and influential. Second, there is often the differences in the perception that Pacific Island governments have and traditional powers in the region have about China. And third, there is a general recognition of the fact that China is a power that is here to stay and we need to figure out how to deal with it. But let me begin by pointing out the importance of the Oceania region. That this is a region that has relatively small countries, small in terms of population as well as in terms of land area. But these are also huge ocean continents because they have huge EEZ or exclusive economic zone that has become and will potentially become much more important as sea lane as well as sources of resources. In terms of resources, the major ones that you find in the region are fisheries, minerals, energy resources, and the potential for deep sea minerals. China has already invested, particularly in fisheries and mineral, and one of the major markets for energy resources, particularly Papua New Guinea's LNG. As a sea lane, Pacific Islands or the Pacific Ocean is not as busy as, say, the South China Sea, but it is likely to become busier in the future. And for China, it is likely to become important as part of its maritime Silk Road. Also, Pacific Island countries are important in international diplomacy. We are talking about 14 independent and freely associated countries that each have a vote at the United Nations. And therefore, it is important to have these countries on one side when we have international negotiations. At the moment, China has a relationship with 8 of the 14 Pacific Island countries, and it includes some of the major countries like Papua New Guinea and Fiji that are not only resource-rich, but also influential in the region as well. And this is opposed to Taiwan that has diplomatic relations with 6 of the Pacific Island countries. This is important for Taipei because this is 6 out of the 18 countries globally that recognize Taiwan. But it also sets the Pacific Islands region as a scene for the rivalry between Taipei and Beijing, and particularly nowadays more than before because of the changes in government in Taipei. And so Pacific Island countries will become important in this Taipei-Beijing rivalry. But China's increasing influence is much more in terms of economics nowadays, or at least for the Pacific Island countries. And this comes in different forms. First, in the form of development assistance, which are 3 types. The first is grants, second, interest-free loans, and third, concessional loans. It's the third one that has raised a lot of discussion in the last couple of years, and particularly because of increasing concern that China is giving loan to Pacific Island countries that they will not be able to repay. And because of that increasing concern that this would give Beijing leverage to be able to influence Pacific Island countries to the extent that it will have or potentially have geostrategic concerns as well. And this is raised in, for instance, recent discussions about the potential for the establishment of a Chinese military base in Vanuatu. Of course, this has been denied both by Beijing as well as the Vanuatu government. But apart from the concessional loan, also important is the trade and investment relationship. China is becoming one of the major trade and investment partners for Pacific Island countries. And this is important not only for the 8 countries that have diplomatic relations with Beijing, but also for the countries that have diplomatic relations with Taipei or Taiwan. That although they have diplomatic relations with Taiwan, China or mainland China is their major trading partner. Solomon Islands and Palau, for instance, are classic examples of this. In terms of perceptions about China, as I mentioned earlier on, the perception of the traditional powers in the region, Australia, New Zealand, the US, France, and so forth, is that China is a potential threat, or if not, already a threat to the region. And this discussion resembles the discussions during the Cold War period and targeting particularly the former Soviet Union. For a lot of Pacific Island countries, the question is whose security? Is it the security of Pacific Island countries or the security of the traditional powers in the region? For Pacific Island governments, or at least the ones that have diplomatic relations with China, China is an alternative opportunity, alternative to the traditional powers that have been in the region since the Second World War. And so there is a degree of acceptance of China as a partner, albeit a cautious acceptance of Chinese influence in the region. China's own perception of its role in the region is, and it often sells itself as a country that promotes a win-win relationship, an equal partnership, and also a relationship that has mutual benefit for the power like China and small Pacific Island countries. And that is something that is a good selling point for the Pacific Islands region. And finally, as I mentioned at the beginning, there is a certain degree of acceptance of the fact that China is a power that is here to stay. And the challenge for Pacific Island countries, as well as the traditional partners in the region, is how do we deal with this new power in ways that is mutually beneficial. I hope that was helpful. Thank you.
It's a shame that he could not join us, but I'm sure the organizers will send our thanks to him for having agreed to prepare this short video. We have about half an hour left, so I would like now to open the floor for questions and comments to our three panelists. Briefly introduce yourself.
Sure. My name is Yang Zi. I'm from the China program RSS. My question is about the point that Professor Thitinan made. I think the point about China engaging establishment is quite interesting, but we mostly talked about political establishment, right? What about something more perennial, like the religious establishment, that are much more immune to elections, right? Because of course we have more like diverse countries, like multiracial, multi-religious countries like Malaysia or Singapore, but in the Philippines, in Thailand, we have huge sections of the population following one religion, and this one religion is governed by this body that's organized in a way it has influence in the capital down to the villages, you know, like Supreme Sangha Council or the Catholic Church and its wings. So if China can influence, you know, these elites in these organizations, it will be quite beneficial. I'm wondering if you could talk about some of the engagement, or if there has been some engagement. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll collect a few questions. So Benjamin Ho from
Hi, yeah, Benjamin from also the China program. So my question, I suppose, is open to all three speakers. It's regarding, I guess you could make an argument that there's often saying that Southeast Asian countries prefer to work with China economically. They look to China, but at the same time look for security, to the US for security. But given that China's economic growth is not inevitable, that there are limitations, and given the uncertainty in the US security dimension and its commitments in the Asia, this part of the world, just like to hear your thoughts on how do you foresee ASEAN in this sense, this regional bloc, playing a role in the coming years with regards, or rather how do your respective governments view ASEAN as a security community with which to sort of bind together as part of this broader hedging strategy vis-a-vis China and the United States?
Thank you. Our side is well represented today. Go ahead.
My name is Goshen. Thank you for the discussion just now. My question, actually, I have one comment and one question. So the first question goes to Professor Thitinan. I agree with you that the China is on the learning curve. I noticed that there's a missing discussion about Chinese NGOs going out, particularly in countries like Myanmar. I realize either Chinese China state-driven organizations such as the China Foundation for Poverty Alleviation, they actually collaborate with American NGOs in terms of learning how to do the microfinancing in the villages. And there are also private Chinese companies who support it, sort of like NGOs in Myanmar, particularly in Mandalay. They are trying to help with like Chinese learning with scientific knowledge and things like that, etc. I wonder in either in Thailand or Malaysia or the Philippines, whether other Chinese NGOs are doing a similar thing. So that is the first question. And the second is, I feel there's an empirical gap between the claims that the Chinese government is having a well-calibrated public diplomacy. Well, on the ground, I did several. How to say? I visited 10 factories in Myanmar this May, and I realized all the Chinese companies, there's only one private company and the other SOEs, the state-owned enterprises. For the state-owned enterprises, SOEs, the managers, they said they wanted to do something different to help with how to say, to establish the China image. However, they're restrained from doing so because in their logic, if they speak more, they have to take more responsibilities. So they said there's sort of like instructions. They should take the responsibilities for every word, every action they take. So they rather do less, do more, but speak less. So that is one phenomenon. But on the other side, the private Chinese companies, they're quite active. They even encourage the integration of the Chinese managers in terms like a relationship with local employees. However, this phenomenon is not seen in the Chinese SOEs. They're forbidden for example, from dating the local employees. So these huge discrepancies in terms of implementation, I really suspect if the Chinese leadership have this coordinated public diplomacy when it comes to the implementation. So that's just my comment. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Dalchin Singh from ISIS.
Two questions, one on Malaysia, Mr. Kuik, and the other one for Thitinan. Now I got the impression from the presentation on Malaysia that China's public diplomacy efforts were concentrated more on the ethnic Chinese in Malaysia. I found that somewhat surprising. Of course, naturally they would do that with ethnic Chinese, but I thought the more important target for them would be those who wield influence with government circles or within government circles. And these would be primarily Malays. So I was a bit surprised. I also want to ask you, are there attempts to cultivate Malay circles, like Malay cultural groups, for visits to China, Islamic groups? Some of this has been happening in Indonesia. Now, question to Thitinan. The three traditional pillars of Thailand power structure, that means the bureaucracy, the military, and the royal circles, the king. Could you comment on efforts made by the Chinese to cultivate influence with the military? Is this increasing? What about royal circles? What is happening? Thank you.
Okay, a lot of new topics. Just to highlight them again: the role of the religious leaders, the role of ASEAN, Chinese NGOs, Chinese business community, the role of Malay circles, and then finally the Thai military and royalty. So you can pick and choose the topics that you want to answer. Aileen?
Yeah, thank you for those excellent questions. Religion, well, unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, but the case is, in the Philippines, the dominant religion is Roman Catholicism, which is seen in China as a Western religion, and China's own policy towards its Catholics, its Christians, is still controversial. No? I think at one point the Philippines was in between efforts of the Vatican and China to resume linkages, but up to now, nothing has come of it. No? So I don't think China will make much headway with the religious hierarchy in the Philippines, especially because of, it is tied to the Pope and the Vatican still. No? On the role of ASEAN, especially ASEAN Security Community, I think this really requires some hard thinking on the part of ASEAN, how to position itself given the new geopolitics. So many challenges, you don't know where to begin. But the fact is, the major issue in ASEAN-China relations in the security aspect has been the South China Sea. And this is already the main arena for geopolitical competition between China and the US in our part of the world. So whether ASEAN can master not just the strength, but the vision, the new ideas, the determination, the consensus, the unity, and the resources to come to develop a strategy or a policy that it can offer, a role that it can play together with both China and the United States. I mean, that's, I think, is the big question. Chinese NGOs, by all means, I think this is a very positive direction, what they're doing now in Myanmar. In one of my past lives, I've also been involved in promoting development cooperation between the Philippines and China through NGOs and development workers. Of course, NGOs in China are not quite the same as NGOs in the Philippines, but we've had very successful, productive cooperation, best practices, that sort of thing. So certainly, I think we should encourage Chinese NGOs, development workers, charitable groups to operate in where they are needed, under the laws of those countries. Private companies, on the other hand, there are good companies and there are bad companies. So the impact may differ depending on what they're doing on the ground in many of these neighboring countries.
I think I'll respond to Daljit and also Benjamin Ho's issues. For Daljit, I like your question. I think we are actually on the same page, but the distinction perhaps is because of the definition of public diplomacy. My understanding of public diplomacy means that it's really about state-sponsored diplomatic activities that are targeted at the non-state sectors, organizations, entities of the target countries. So meaning that it's not government sectors are not really included. I mean the state elites. Those are actually state diplomacy rather than public diplomacy. So without saying that China's diplomacy, G2G level, state diplomacy, certainly focused about the mainly on the Malay elites. That's without saying. But since our issue here is public diplomacy, and as I say, in terms of socio-economic and socio-economic groups, and also private sectors, and the people, youth and media and all that, I did emphasize that they do engage all ethnic groups, but proportionately it's mainly focused so far, have been focused mainly on the ethnic Chinese rather than Malay groups. So I think we are on the same page, but it's just the definition. And about Ben's observation about whether or not our understanding about, I mean, for a long time when it comes to Southeast Asia interactions with the big powers, economically, ASEAN countries have been pursuing very closely, mainly with China, and then security with, or military with the United States. My observation, at least in the case of a few countries, is that I think this pattern is slowly changing. And I would say that since I'm from Malaysia, and then I would use this example to illustrate this changing pattern. More importantly is that I think most countries do not see all these issues in an either-or fashion. So I think practically, theoretically, we can develop both economic and security relationship with ethnic powers, China and US particularly. But in the case of Malaysia, you do see something that I would say that is quite puzzling, in the sense that Malaysia's defense cooperation, it's really like we are latecomer. So meaning that the starting point is really very late. Only in 1994 that we begin to establish defense attaché with China. And then it took another 10 years. In 2005, we have defense MOU. And then nothing much really happened until I would say after 2013. And interestingly, and I would say that it's counterintuitive, 2013 is really the time when Malaysian elites' threat perception about China has been on the rise. Primarily because of, earlier on we believed that we have a special relationship with China. And when it comes to South China Sea, China treats us differently. But what happened after 2013? Malaysian elites begin to realize that actually no difference, nothing special. They when they become more assertive, when they make presence in South China Sea, they also come to our water or near our waters. So we become more alarmed after 2013. But as I said, counterintuitively, it was on that basis that Malaysian government began to develop and enhance defense cooperation with China. And we do see from no military exercise with China to one after another from 2015 onwards. And then even arms procurement. You can say that perhaps they have to do with some special interests, but generally that reflect the changing strategy in the sense that the more we, the smaller states, become more concerned about China and China's security effort, the more reasons that we need to develop some security and military cooperation with the rising power.
I'll just add to Aileen and Cheng-Chwee very quickly. Chinese don't do religions. I don't see them doing the religious engagement in Thailand. In fact, they want to marginalize because we had a case of Falun Gong, and then with Marxist roots, societies with Marxist roots are not big on religion, and then it could also become a challenge to the Chinese system, to the party, to the state. So we haven't seen that in Thailand with the Buddhist order. Southeast Asia look to China for economic development, the US for security. I think it's more nuanced and mixed than that. I mean, the US still has the largest stock of direct investment in the region, in many countries in the region. ASEAN is divided, and it's a long answer and long discussion, but I would just say very briefly that ultimately and unironically, China has divided ASEAN, and ultimately it's against China's interest to do that. This is two good questions about this learning curve. To me, the issue is this. At issue is, China's learning, there's no doubt. Is it learning fast enough for where it wants to go? It's like a race against its ambition. And the jury's out. I don't know, I see some signs that they're learning fast. So tourists, for example, 10 years ago, Chinese tourists are everywhere, right? And we have record high tourist numbers in Thailand, despite all the messy politics and everything. Double-digit growth every year. And I was just at the Grand Palace a few days ago, and I look out there. 30 years ago, that scene would have been Caucasian, right? White hair with red hair. I look out there, the scene was all black hair. Not a white person on the scene. Chinese tourists, and over the last decade, they have the behavior is improving. I'm not saying it was bad to begin with, but there were certain things that the Chinese tourists did that the Thais didn't like. But I think that they have some training now, some videos about how to be a good tourist or how to be a tourist. Now, for the companies, NGOs, NGOs, learning curve, companies, interesting, the implementation gap. And this is a big dilemma for China because the system, the way that it is, the way that it approaches issues and countries and societies is going to be tough because they're not an open culture. So they're going to have an emphasis on control, you don't say too much, so there's a gap. There is a gap. Last point from Logit, and here's a good example of how China doesn't diversify enough in its engagements with elites, right? So the military, they engage with military, and of course they're actually selling submarines, selling all kinds of weapon systems, and taking advantage, in fact, capitalizing on the post-coup military government of 4 years now in Thailand. But when it comes to the very important role of the monarchy, China has been very warm, courteous, I think, to the princess for a very long time, for the sister of the new king. But not so much the new king. When he was a crown prince, hardly went to China. His sister, the princess, has a home there, almost a second home, speaks in Chinese and so on. So I'm not sure if they placed a wrong bet or it was just a general kind of diplomacy that they did. But it's noticeable.
Thank you, Thitinan. Are there any? Yes, Melly.
Because you keep on talking about learning, Thitinan. we seem to be, in the 1990s when we wanted to bring China into the multilateral fold, we always say, well, China can learn from us, it's part of socializing China, but it's always seemed 10 years later, 20 years later, it seems to be learning one way, one direction. China learning from us. But isn't it, and this is related to the whole value that Ralph was asking, one of the so-called successes of China is the value that it puts on development. It talks about the developmental state. And could it be that while we think that China is learning, the strategy that China actually tries to employ is for the rest of the world to learn from China? I want to get your comment on that.
Samantha Costa.
Thank you all for your presentations, and I've enjoyed our sidebar conversations as well about the three countries that you represent. I have a question. So we, in the report this morning, talked about our measure of foreign policy alignment being the connection with Beijing trying to use bilateral relationships to influence UN General Assembly voting. But what we have also discussed a little bit in the country studies is there a parallel in terms of Beijing using bilateral relationships in ASEAN, for example, to influence regional multilaterals like ASEAN? We didn't really talk about that very much in the report, but I'd love to hear your take. Do you see that playing out in the Philippines and Thailand and Malaysia?
Final question will be from my colleague Alan John.
Okay, thank you to the panel for your insights. Now these two are specific to Philippines and Malaysia. Now in relation to the Philippines, do you see that there's actually this very firm underpinning of Chinese public diplomacy in the midst of the Philippine economy in terms of real estate? Again, here I have to ask you about Ayala Land. How much are its profits being bolstered by Chinese property acquisitions in Manila, and some speculate potentially Boracay after the cleanup, and so on. So if you could just shed light on that. Malaysia, perhaps I could get you, Cheng-Chwee, to talk about Forest City. I believe ISIS has some experts also looking at Forest City as a demonstration project for Chinese investment. Is that potentially going to be a success story, or is it one of those abortions that Chinese public diplomacy may occasionally have to perform to cut their losses and so on?
Okay, we're moving into real estate now. Yes, go ahead.
I'm Hook Kwang from RSIS. My question is in reference to our lunch speaker, Ambassador Bilahari, spoke about. So can I ask the panel to share with us their experience on some of the issues we raised, especially with regards to, for example, the so-called narrative that China wants to promote in your respective countries, the issue of psychological manipulation, and the issue of how to protect or strengthen the country's defenses against such attacks.
Okay. Thank you. So why don't we reverse the order this time around and start with Thitinan, and then we'll move forward.
Millie's question about learning, and essentially you're asking, maybe perhaps it should be more mutual, it should go both ways. Another way we can look at it is about adjusting. It's not just about learning. They're just trying to adjust to where they want to go, to where they are now, and where they want to go. But in so doing, they're learning in the process how to be a superpower, giant neighbor, and swinging its weight around. And over the years, I've noticed that they are learning. I mean, and as I said before, the big question is, for where they want to go, is it satisfactory? It may not be, but big challenge for them. As a developmental state, they want. And you're saying that they want to be appealing to other countries, perhaps this is their value, maybe, have the cake and eat it too. Who doesn't want to do that? Centralized control, economic dynamism. The Thai generals love it. The Thai prime minister likes to pass around Xi Jinping's Red Book, the personal philosophy. But it doesn't have, I think, that broad of appeal. But it has a kind of a resurgence or upsurge in authoritarian tendencies in the region. So the jury is out, but I don't think that they want to just have the world to learn from them. But I think that this is their way. If you want to learn from them, great. But if not, it's their way. Now the question, I'll just do the one just now about psychological manipulation. And we'll have a concluding session, or maybe I can talk a bit more. I don't put it that way. I think this whole kind of sunlight and darkness is a misplaced analogy and metaphor. It's very dangerous. So, yeah, I mean, the Chinese manipulate. A lot of countries, have manipulation. The Chinese, I haven't seen personally. I mean, there's obviously in Australia very salient and serious case of maybe manipulation, covert activities, and so on. Other areas we've seen some. I haven't seen it as systematic as such. And in the Cold War days, we had communist expansionism and propaganda and covert activities as such. I haven't seen it to that level. It could be around. Bilateral, I'll say very quickly, China is bilateral. I mean, bilateral before anything else. Before they go regional, plurilateral, multilateral, it's bilateral first and foremost. UN and other areas.
I think very quick response to Alan's question on Forest City, and then I would address Saman Time, so the last question. For Forest City, it's interesting in the sense that it is quite different from many other projects that we talk about. On one important respect, in the sense that unlike other projects, ECRL, SSER, even the proposed HSR, high-speed rail between Kuala Lumpur and Singapore, those are all with government involvement, government entities. But Forest City is not. It's actually a private activities. It's a Guangdong-based property developer who has an interest to develop Forest City into a residential project. So that's a different category, and I do not really have crystal ball, so I'm not going to predict whether or not it's going to be successful and so forth. And for Samantha's question about, I think very interesting, about bilateral, multilateral, whether or not the bilateral diplomacy or relationship between China and individual countries have some kind of spillover effect to multilateral. I think there are lots of examples, not just South China Sea, but there are other issues. South China Sea people would quote very quickly about Cambodia, so on and so forth. But I would like to highlight beyond that, and that's actually something that happened even much earlier. You can say, and since we have Mahathir 2.0, let me use Mahathir 1.0 as an example. So during 1990s, we do see Malaysia and China actually work hand in hand to promote the so-called East Asia cooperation. I think the first attempt by Mahathir when he tried to promote EAEG, EAEC did not succeed in go anywhere. But when Asian financial crisis happened, Mahathir did try to push the envelope, working together with the three non-visitor countries, but particularly China, to push through ASEAN Plus 3. So that is one example of seeing the kind of bilateral and also multilateral linkages. My final point, and it's about the psychological exploitation. And I do, since perhaps this is my final point for this session, for this conference, I would like to actually link that to not only Bilahari's statement, but actually something that is contained in the report, by saying that I think the report is excellent, but I do have one suggestion because of what has been portrayed here as if the way Malaysian government has been interacting with China's public diplomacy and also the infrastructure project as if it's mainly about economic, about cash eating, so and so forth, and development benefits. I don't deny that, that is very important. But the case of Malaysia being the most receptive country on this issue, I would like to highlight that actually there are much more than that. It's not just about the development consideration. It has a lot to do with the ruling elite, the leadership's own judgment about how we, the smaller state, should engage, what extent we should engage a rising power in geographical proximity. So I would say that it's not just about Najib. In fact, Mahathir has been the one who steered Malaysia's China policy throughout the post-Polo era from one of a very hostility to cordiality. What Najib has been doing is on the basis of what he already established during the 1.0 era. So it was Mahathir's own judgment. I have 3 interviews with Mahathir, and then on those issues. And he made it very, very clear. And I thought that is very different, that distinguished Malaysia's case with many other ASEAN countries, in the sense that Malaysian leaders, especially Malay elites, are very pragmatic in seeing China not just an economic power, but as a permanent factor. China is here, and we need to maintain a very good political relationship with China. And linking Bilahari's statement, I don't think that is very much because of China's diplomatic push to influence us. It's actually leadership's own judgment that, look, we are in Southeast Asia. China is just there. We can choose friends, we cannot choose neighbors, and international relations also. So I would say that psychological manipulation and all that is there. I think any bigger power will always have a tendency. But sometimes the choice on the part of non-big powers, it's also a matter of their own judgment, and also a matter of calculation of short-term and also long-term trade-off. I think I'll stop.
Yeah, I would support that final point by Cheng-Chwee. What I would like to stress from Bilahari's remarks is that China's influence can take 3 forms. And he talked about persuasion, he talked about inducement, and he talked about coercion. Meaning all of this happened in different platforms and with different targets. So I wouldn't say that China has all of these sinister designs, using public diplomacy for influence. So that's there, and that's all how all big powers behave. I mean, the Philippines has had close relations with other big powers, and that's been also the nature of the relationship for decades. So I think we know what lobbying is all about, the psychological forms and everything. So it's not, I don't think it's particularly unique to China. We are a bit more concerned because of the nature of the Chinese regime. I think that's also part of our the issue here, and we're not about to change that. We're not capable of changing that. So my point is, sometimes it's the preferences of the elites themselves in these countries. So it's not China necessarily all the time, foisting itself, but the elites of these countries seeing China also in a very instrumental fashion to attain their own agendas. So we may see it as China's successful public diplomacy and influence, but internally, it can be explained by other factors that the elites of these countries see China also as useful, and therefore, right on this, Belt and Road and whatever China wants to hear. So I think there's also that dimension. The question on real estate, I think, well, I don't know about Ayala, but I did speak recently with a real estate developer. It's just starting in the Philippines. It's been happening in other neighboring states for some time, but because we're always a latecomer, then it's just starting, really. But yes, China's effect on the real estate market is growing. What the developer I spoke with said that 60% of their new projects right now are being gobbled up by Chinese market. But they're deciding to be wise, and they're going to try to reduce the percentage over time, because they also don't see it as a long-term prospect, and that will continue to be sensitive to political factors in the relations, not just between China and the Philippines, but China's status in the region, more broadly speaking. So there is that effect. I don't know about Ayala specifically.
Thank you. I believe we all deserve a hot beverage, and we will have a break until 10 to 4 when the final session will start. But before we do so, please join me in thanking our 3 panelists.